And for many of you, that may be review or overly simplistic, but just bear with me. I'm going to put it all in context. So the question we want to ask is, what is thought? Well, this is the stuff of thought, neurons. We all know what neurons are. They're brain cells, and they connect to one another called junctions that are called synapses. And they signal one another with brief electrical impulses that we call spikes. These are brief, sharp electrical impulses that last about a millisecond or so. And it's thought that the neurons communicate one another with spiking through these synapses. And this is captured here, this nice little video of spiking activity going down the networks of neurons all connected together, zipping down neural pathways like telegraph wires. And we brains have a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to focus on the cortex today. But the cortex works, of course, in conjunction with subcortical areas, but just the cortex alone, where your higher thinking emerges, has 20 billion neurons, just the cortex alone, that forms 10 to the 14 synaptic connections. I don't know what the number 10 to the 14 is called. Let's just call it a gazillion. Now, at first, neurons were poorly understood, and sometimes they were regarded as like mere building blocks. They weren't really regarded as necessarily having any function. They were like kind of like bricks or scaffolding without distinct roles of their own. This is the early days of neuroscience. And the brain was largely seen as a larger set of anatomical areas that each have their own function, and they work like the body's organs, and they all work together to somehow produce the mind. Now, why do we think that way? Well, limitations in technology. Up until the mid 20th century, we didn't have any way of really eavesdropping on the electrical activity of individual neurons. So the focus naturally was on what we could measure, which is the brain's anatomy. And also importantly, you have to start somewhere. If you're going to figure out if something is complicated as the brain, you don't dive right into all the detailed emergent properties. You got to build your knowledge up. And this was just a stepping stone to get to where we are now. Now, another major stepping stone was about in the 1950s. We developed technology to study the electrical spiking, these little impulses from individual neurons one at a time. And this led to a major discovery that neurons are not merely scaffolding or bricks. They are little information processing units. And this is captured by the Nobel Prize-winning work of Hubel and Wiesel. You have your subject here, the kitty cat staring at a screen, and a oriented line appears. And back in primary visual cortex, way at the back of the brain, Hubel and Wiesel found things like a neuron that spikes at the site of this particular left-leaning line in that particular location and that particular orientation. Kind of like a Geiger counter for this one specific visual feature. And of course, they found other neurons that do other things, detect other edges in other places. And the idea was that every neuron is specialized for its own little information processing, and neurons they act like feature detectors that detect different things, and each neuron sends a different message. And this led to the way we thought about the brain, especially the cortex, in the 20th century, and it is connectionism. The general idea was the cortex is kind of wired like a big elaborate telegraph system that combines signals together. So here we have our spikes traveling down the wires with synaptic connections. And the idea is that synapses, by virtue of their weight, how strongly they influence one another, can act like logic gates. So this is captured in this diagram here. Sorry, somebody say something? Okay. This is sort of captured.
You want to mute those.
Unmute me. Now I'm unmuted. Hey, that wasn't me. I didn't touch anything. So anyway, this idea of this connectionism in the brain like a telegraph system is captured in this plot here. What we have here is we have our neurons back in primary visual cortex. Back here in primary visual cortex, and they're the edge detectors you saw earlier. Sorry, backing up a bit. And these edge detectors, they converge onto another stage of processing, another set of neurons, and those neurons combine the signal, and now you have a neuron that detects a longer edge. Then these longer edge neurons converge onto another layer of processing, and another set of neurons combine their signals, and now you have things like corner detectors. And eventually you combine until you get neurons that represent whole images or whole things like faces or cats and dogs or these bent paperclip like images. The idea is that you combine to get this a set of specialized neurons that detect things on a very high level. And with 20 billion neurons in cortex, the general idea was that if you get enough circuits and you combine enough, eventually you'll get peace, love, and understanding. That was the idea. And this is probably familiar to all of you even now, because this is how AI works. These large language models are trained on large data sets, and they work by adjusting their connections, their versions of synaptic connections, to capture statistical patterns in the data. So what now? I'm obviously here to tell you that we think differently now, and a couple of things led to this different new view of the cortex. One is that it was found that at the highest stages of cortical processing, there's not a bunch of special neurons that are few numbers of neurons that are specialized for a few things. Rather, information is distributed across many neurons. And that's very different from the connections and viewpoint. So this began around the turn of the 20th, 21st century, where several of us, not just my lab, but others, began to train animals on more complex behaviors. Rather than just have the animals stare at a screen and look for an edge, or just simply press a button or pull a lever, we began to train animals to do more complex tasks that are sort of approaching the kind of things humans do. So we did things like we trained animals to categorize a bunch of images as cats versus dogs. These were 3 prototype cats, 3 prototype dogs, and we used a morphing algorithm to morph or blend all the shapes. So there's this continuous shape space here. And what we taught the animals is we made a sharp dividing line in the middle and taught the animals anything on one side of the line was a cat, anything on the other side of the line was a dog. And we could draw this line literally anywhere and get the same result. And then I'll tell you what that result is in a moment. But we also trained monkeys. When Andreas Nieder was a postdoc in the laboratory, he trained monkeys to recognize the small numbers 1 through 5 or 1 through 6. Actually, we went up to about 8 at one point. And here's an example here. These are These are neurons here that are all representing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we have all these controls for low-level visual features. And the animal's job was to ignore what the individual displays look like and just tell us what the number is, whether it's number 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5. And we also taught monkeys to do things like learn rules, switch between matching and non-matching tasks. Here's a picture of Chef here on the left, and then given 2 other pictures, the animal varied between either choosing the same picture, matching it, choosing the one that matched the earlier picture, or choosing a different picture. So the animal to keep in mind which rule was enforced at that particular time, where it should choose the same stimulus or choose a different one. And we recorded the top of the cortical hierarchy, where all this sort of combining stuff is supposed to go on according to connectionism. And what we found is that neurons in the prefrontal cortex seemed to absorb all this top-down information. They weren't actually very sensitive to low-level visual features. There wasn't this combining up to specialist neurons. Rather, all the low-level visual features are thrown away, and these neurons in the prefrontal cortex just seemed to absorb all this top-down information. They told you whether the stimulus was a cat or dog. They told you what the number was. They told you whether the animal was following the rule, same versus different. But they didn't really care about the details of sensory experience, like which individual cat it was or what display was on the screen. All they seemed to care about is the top-down information. And that was one surprise from the connectionist viewpoint. The other surprise is this information was distributed across not a small number of specialized neurons, but large populations of neurons, 30 to 40% of randomly selected neurons in the population. And that's very different from the predictions of connectionism, which predicts highly specialized neurons and small numbers of them. So what does the prefrontal cortex do with all this top-down information? Well, in 2001, Jonathan Cohn and I published a paper suggesting that the prefrontal cortex absorbs all this top-down information, all this acquired knowledge about the world, and it uses it to build models of the rest of the cortex. To use an analogy, it acts like a conductor in a rail yard. It builds a model, a map of the rest of the cortex of the rest of the tracks, then uses it like a conductor to direct neural activity down the correct path. And that's captured here. Here's the prefrontal cortex building a model of what circuits need to be activated in the rest of cortex. And then it uses this top-down influence to make the cortex follow activity patterns that correspond to the model the prefrontal cortex has built. So what this suggests all is that cortical processing is not this drive towards specialization. Rather, it's the opposite. It's a drive towards dimensionality reduction. And this is a new paper that Lisa Feldman and Baird and I just published just this last week, where we make this argument that cortical processing is the opposite of the way connectionism taught us. It's not a drive towards highly specialized neurons. Rather, it's more like this. It's an experience-dependent dimensionality reduction, where the outside world, detailed information from the outside world in the initial processing areas of cortex, like primary visual, auditory, and sensory cortex, are constantly funneling information down through these converging pathways to distill out just the top-down goal-relevant essence and throw away the sensory details. And furthermore, this distilled information is again distributed across large populations of multifunctional neurons with what we now call mixed selectivity, not a bunch of specialized neurons. When I first presented the results, about 30 or 40% of the neurons in the prefrontal cortex did cat versus dog versus numbers. I got some pushback from them. People would say, well, if a third of the cortex is being used for cat versus dogs, then that must mean the monkey's brain would fill up after 3 things. How can that be true? And John Duncan and I argued that that must mean that a lot of cortical neurons are multifunctional. They're not specialized. We've since come to know that these neurons are not just multifunctional, but they're multifunctional in a very specific way. They show this property called mixed selectivity. And I'm going to just explain what this property of mixed selectivity is, because it really is key to how the cortex does a lot of its high-end cortical processing. So here's an example of a task where the animal's job was to remember 2 pictures and their order. So the animal saw 2 pictures in sequence. First, 1 picture, object 1. Then it saw object 2. Then after a delay, there was 3 objects presented. And the monkey's job was to saccade to the 2 objects it saw before in the correct order. So in this case, the animal's maintaining central gaze. When the 3 pictures comes up, it looks at the butterfly first, then the padlock second, because that's the order in which the objects are seen. Simple sequence memory task. Now, according to the classic connectionist theory, is that it should result in a bunch of specialized neurons. There'd be neurons. Here's an example of 3 neurons here. This neuron, 1 neuron responds, and this is neural activity on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and this is during the gray areas are during the presentation of the 2 objects. The connectionist model predicts a bunch of specialized neurons. There'll be neurons that will always respond most, give the most spikes to the padlock, and maybe the least spikes to the butterfly. And those neurons will always do the same thing. Every time a padlock or a butterfly appears, the neurons always convey the same signal. And there might be other neurons that just keep track of order selectivity. So some neurons will just keep track of first versus second. And these neurons are all specialized for their either recognizing the objects or keeping track of order. But when you actually record in the prefrontal cortex, as we did, you find something very different. You find a bunch of neurons that show this property of mixed selectivity. They change their selectivity with context. So here's a collection of 3 neurons. This 1 neuron here responds most to the padlock when it appears first. That's the green color. I'm sorry, most to the padlock when it appears first, the green color. And it responds least to the butterfly when it appears first. But then when the objects appear second, in this other context of being second, now these neurons show a very different pattern of selectivity, with the butterfly evoking the most activity and the padlock evoking the least activity. So essentially what these neurons are doing is they're changing which objects they signal depending on the context in which the object is seen, first versus second. So these neurons are multiplexing a combination of the task factors, both the object identity and the order in which they appeared, which was relevant for the task. So they spiked the different combinations of different objects, different combination of different objects in their different order. In other words, they're different contexts. These neurons are showing context-dependent behavior. And if we could describe cognition in one simple phrase, it's context-dependent behavior. You don't always respond the same way to the world. You can respond differently in different situations, depending on the situation at hand. And these mixed selectivity neurons are doing just that, just showing that very context-dependent behavior we associate with high-level cognition. And this makes them flexible, and again, it makes their spiking context-dependent. So that makes a lot of sense. We have these neurons that show this embodiment of this flexible context-dependent behavior. But then my colleagues, Stefano Fusi and Mattia Rigatti, using data Melissa Warden collected in the lab, they built a computational model that showed that mixed selectivity property is actually critical for cognition. It gives the brain more computational horsepower. What these complex neurons and all this multiplexing of properties gives is it allows the brain to form a nonlinear, high-dimensional representational space that can solve more complex problems than you can solve with a population of specialized neurons. And their flexibility, being able to respond to different things in different situations, greatly speeds up the ability of the model to learn. And it also increases the storage capacity of the model, because now instead of the information being stored in a few specialized neurons, all the information is distributed across many neurons. So it makes the model essentially capacity unlimited. So in many ways, these neurons, these mixed selectivity neurons, which we first discovered in the prefrontal cortex, but now in subsequent years, it seems they're everywhere. They've been reported in the olfactory bulb, in primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex. They seem to be a core computational thing that the brain does. But these mixed selectivity neurons, because they don't have one favorite thing they spike to, and they reflect all these combinations of things, this is a major challenge to the connectionist model. It tells us that the cortex is not a drive towards these specialized neurons. Instead, it means the cortex and specialized circuits. Instead, it means that the cortex is a web of overlapping multifunctional networks that constantly interact, not a collection of specialized circuits or specialized networks. It's more like this, where all the brain cortical networks are all lying on top of one another, all sharing connections, and somehow the information needs to be routed through this overlapping network and get to the right places. And this is the problem here of what really comes down to where the connectionist model really struggles with. It's not just that there's a different type of neuron we saw, or the information is across more neurons. It shows that the cortex is this web of overlapping networks. And this is a critical problem for connectionism because we have executive control over our brains. We can somehow control this system. We take charge of our thoughts. We don't just react to inputs like a thermostat or like AI. AI just merely responds to inputs. We act differently depending on the situation. We act differently in a concert hall versus a lecture room, in a restaurant versus a picnic. We act differently depending on the situation. That's the essence of cognition, is that flexibility in behavior. And we also do things like we set goals and we make future plans. So we have control over this system. And we do this flexibly to navigate a fast-paced world. We can change our mind on the fly from moment to moment and do different things depending on the demands of the world. It seems impossibly complex to build a control system that works just by pure connectionism alone, by shifting around connections, by changing weights of connections. It would require on-the-fly sub-second control of gazillions of connections between a gazillion synapses, again, in real time. So imagine having to do this all by here's a representative of a manual switchboard, telephone switchboard here. Some of you young people may not know what that is, but in order to make a phone call way back in the early days of phone calls, someone had to physically connect a wire to you so you could talk to the person you want to talk to. This is kind of what connectionism leads to. You got to be able to switch all the wires around on the fly, and that just seems impossibly complex. So what's the solution? Well, the solution, we believe, is brainwaves. Brainwaves are rhythmic fluctuations in the electric field surrounding neurons. It's produced by the spiking, because when neurons spike, they change the electrical environment. But at the same time, they can turn around and influence spiking because their electric field changes. Now, the brain oscillates at all sorts of different frequencies, everything from delta and even lower, 1 time a second, all the way up to 30 to 100 hertz or more. And but they're often grouped into these different frequency bands, which are somewhat arbitrary, but generally they're associated with cognitive states, such as the lower frequencies with deep sleep and relaxed wakefulness, and then you get the higher frequencies when you're focusing your attention. Now, ironically, these are the first electrical signal measured from the brain, long before we could measure the activity of individual neurons. But when the focus in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, shifted to neurons and connectors and what the properties of individual neurons are, brainwaves were dismissed as non-functional, as the humming of a car engine, as an epiphenomenon. And just parenthetically, I want to banish the word epiphenomenon from science in general and neuroscience in particular. None of us, we've barely scratched the surface of how the brain works. It's a little premature to call an electrical signal from the brain and an electrical system as epiphenomenon. So whenever I hear words like, oh, that must probably only epiphenomenon, maybe epiphenomenal, when I hear the word epiphenomenal, I hear doesn't fit my theory. And if your theory can't explain the observations, it's the theory that's falling short, not that the observations are irrelevant. So we now know this is not true. What we do know now through a large body of work is that brainwaves do, in fact, these electrical fields, in fact, influence neurons. They're made of the same stuff as spikes. Spikes are rapid changes in electrical potential. Well, electric field, we measure them as local field potentials, or LFPs, but it's the kind of equivalent to measuring EEG from outside the skull, is there are also changes in electric voltage, just happening on a larger spatial and longer time scale. And through a process called a fat decoupling, direct electrical influences, they strongly shape when and where neurons spike in cortex. This is not an epiphenomenon. Go do a Google Scholar search on fat decoupling. You will see literally thousands of papers demonstrating this. It's like, so having these electrical signals, these spiking influence the electrical field environment, and the electrical field environment can then turn around and influence spiking. It's like laying powerful radio waves on top of the telegraph system. But now the waves have the ability to modulate the impulses in the wire. And if you want an example of how easy it is, how waves can be used to organize spiking of large populations of a gazillion neurons. Here's a crowd doing the wave. You see the wave moving from right to left across the stand here with this, as fans stand up and sit back down. Well, just with a few simple organizing principles, this crowd of people who have very little direct communication with one another, except for a nearest neighbor, can produce this organized behavior. Imagine what 4 billion years of evolution can do with that principle. And we know this because, much like sports fans in a stadium, normal spiking does follow waves. So here's an example of a bandpass brainwave here. And we see this all over cortex, all over in subcortex too, in places like hippocampus and olfactory bulb. You see that spiking tracks phase locks at different phases of the wave, because it makes sense, because what these electrical field waves are changes in excitability, more excitability and less excitability. So of course, the neurons are going to spike more when the electric field environment gets into a more excitable state. But why is this useful? Because brain waves are ideal. Electric field influences are ideal for cognitive control. Wave functions are simple and efficient. You want to control all the people in this crowd and make them all do the same thing, like create this wave. Well, you have a choice. Either you can modulate all the interactions between people one at a time with nearest neighbors, one synapse at a time across a gazillion synapses, or you can throw a simple wave function. Wave functions are very simple, mathematically simple, and once you have it, you know the wave's action both in the near future and across space. So rather than controlling individuals one by one, you can use a simple wave function to guide the entire group. And this isn't conjecture. Here's an example here of a recording from the prefrontal cortex. These are electrical potentials. This is a grid of arrays on the surface of the lateral prefrontal cortex. Each square is one electrode, and what's shown in color is the electric voltage values at each of the electrodes. And this is recorded, I'll show you this again later. This is recorded when the animal is performing a working memory task. And this is not data that's it's raw data. It's not like averaged or reified in any way. This is raw data. You can clearly see, or I think you could see, a wave rotating counterclockwise across the surface of cortex, much like this stadium fans doing the wave. And to carry this point even further, Waves are a natural point to produce, natural way to produce not just simple organization like a circular wave, but more complex organization. For example, consider this metaphor: grains of sand on a speaker. If you put a bunch of grains of sand on a speaker and you play tones, what happens is the sands shuffle around to match the interference patterns of the waves and form these geometric shapes. And that's a general idea here. Think of the sand as the spiking individual neurons, and the sound waves are the brain's electrical brain waves, changing the timing of when spiking occurs and where spiking occurs. And the waves are waves, sound waves, electric waves, they all work by the same principles. So imagine the difficulty of having to make these patterns one grain of sand at a time. You have to organize your cortex one synapse at a time to make all the spiking be nice and coordinated. With waves, it's easy. The organization naturally falls out of wave patterns. Now, over the past 10 years or so, our laboratory has marshaled a bit of evidence for the role of two particular frequency bands in executive or top-down control of cortical processing. What we found is that excitatory activity, lots of spiking, is associated with bursts of gamma, high frequency above 30 hertz oscillations that coincide with the spiking, and they feed forward sensory information from the back of the brain to the front of the brain. At the same time, flowing in the opposite direction are influences at a lower set of frequencies, alpha beta, just below gamma, from about 10 to 25 hertz. And we found that these alpha beta waves actually have an inhibitory influence on the feed forward gamma and spiking. So think of the bottom up gamma as sensory information flooding into your brain, it's excitatory, and opposing it in the opposite direction, controlling it, are these top down inhibitory influences carried by alpha beta waves. And they're inhibitory. They suppress or filter the gamma and the spiking. Now, your cortex has multiple layers, 6 layers, and we know anatomically that the superficial layers of cortex, layers 4 and above, are the feed-forward layers of cortex, while the deep layers of cortex, 5 and 6, are the feedback layers of cortex. So if this gamma versus beta feed-forward and feedback is true, we should expect to see them localize into the correct layers of cortex. And we do. We found that the gamma is stronger in the superficial layers of cortex. Feed-forward gamma is stronger in the superficial layers of cortex, the feed-forward layers. And the alpha beta power, which we associate with feedback processing, is indeed stronger in the deep feedback layers of cortex. And here's summarizing a lot of work. We've basically found that top-down influencers are carried in the deep layers of cortex. They feed back from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, front of cortex to the back cortex, using alpha beta waves. The alpha beta waves then cohere to the superficial layers of cortex, where they have an inhibitory influence on spiking in gamma that's feeding forward sensory information. So that's the model. And we first developed this model and these influences studying the prefrontal cortex. Since then, in just 2024, Alex Major and from my laboratory and Diego Mendoza Halliday from Bob Desmond's laboratory did a heroic study where they studied laminar recordings from the laminar electrodes that were recorded from all layers of cortex simultaneously. They studied them in over 20 cortical areas in mice, 2 species of primates, marmoset and macaques, and also human surgical patients. And we found this gamma superficial feed forward, alpha beta deep layers feedback. We found it everywhere we looked in cortex, every cortical area and across 4 different species. So the cortex is segregating these feed forward and feedback influences. And when you see something this common, this ubiquitous, and this strong is everywhere in cortex, you know it's something fundamental to what the cortex is doing. Now, the way this works is captured in a model that we published in Michael Lundquist back in 2023, a model we call spatial computing. So think of the bottom-up gamma and the spiking as kind of like spray paint being sprayed into your brain. That's information from the outside world, all the information flooding your brain. It's spray paint going into your cortex. And the idea is the control comes from these alpha beta rhythms that act like stencils that prevent some parts of cortex from becoming activated by the bottom-up inputs. And that's how you exert control. The stencils control which parts of cortex can react to bottom-up inputs. And by controlling the stencil, the brain controls cortical processing. And I think of this model of spatial computing as the update to our previous, the Miller and Cohn model we published back in 2001. Back then, we thought of it all in terms of connectionism and spikes carrying influences down, down anatomical connections through synapses and influencing posterior cortex this way in this strict connectionism model. But now we're thinking it's the same general principle here where the prefrontal cortex is producing this top-down influence that guides the rest of cortex. But now we think it's happening via these wave dynamics, particularly the alpha beta inhibitory waves. So just to bring this point home, I mentioned the mixed selectivity property that seem to be so important for cognition. Well, how did this property of mixed selectivity, these weird neurons with these weird combinations of that multiplex different things, how do they come about? What creates them? Well, we found that this spatial computing can explain mixed selectivity. The idea here is you get different alpha beta patterns for the different contexts. There's one alpha beta pattern that inhibits patches of cortex that correspond to the context of being the first stimulus. And as a result, only neurons in this unaffected part of cortex can react to the butterfly when it appears first. Then when the second stimulus comes along, there's a different pattern of alpha beta, a different stencil, and that inhibits another patch of cortex. And now neurons in this other unaffected patch can only respond to the stimulus that happens to appear, the padlock. So essentially the alpha beta patterns are like stencils that control which neurons can spike in which task context, in this case, first versus second. But it applies to all task factors, whether it's match or non-match, or whether you're enacting a plan. The idea is that these alpha beta patterns are controlling where in cortex, when and where cortical neurons can spike. And the result is you get neurons just by these two different alpha beta stencils. That what naturally falls out of it are neurons with nonlinear context-dependent spiking. That is mixed selectivity. And from that, you get all the computational benefits of mixed selectivity that are so important for high-level cognition. So, more evidence that brain waves are playing a critical role in brain function comes from studies of general anesthesia, which I'm doing with my colleague at MIT, Emery Brown, who's not only a professor at MIT in the Pitt-Gower Institute, he's also a practicing anesthesiologist. And this may be disturbing to know because anesthesia has been around since 1846. Doctors don't really know why anesthesia makes you unconscious. They just know that it works. It's like a lot of things in medicine. And there's been this tacit assumption that what anesthesia does is simply just shut off your cortex. What we found in conducting this work with Emery is that it doesn't just shut off your cortex. What it does is anesthesia dramatically changes the brainwave dynamics. So here, on the left here, is what happens after anesthesia. General anesthesia shifts cortex to these low frequencies. So in the awake brain, what you see, these are local field potential recordings from 4 different cortical areas: frontal cortex, parietal cortex, sensory cortex. Those are the LFPs, or electric fields. And down below are the spiking activity of neurons recorded from the same electrodes. And what happens in the normal awake state, you get all these high frequencies and all this spiking happening a lot of the time. And then when you lose consciousness due to general anesthesia, your cortex, all the frequencies shift down to these lower frequencies, primarily in the below theta and below, with a lot of power in the delta, or 1 time a second band. And what happens then is all the spiking activity in cortex strongly coheres in these up and down states to these now low frequency oscillations. So your cortex isn't just shutting off, it's changing to these low frequency domain. And the other thing it does is it also scrambles the alignment of the brain waves below 30 hertz. So you can kind of see that here in this spiking activity. Here's 2 up and down states from parietal cortex here and sensory cortex, and you can see how misaligned they are. They drift in and out of alignment. we quantified this directly. Alexandra Barton did publish a paper just last year in Cell Reports, showing that the anesthesia doesn't just shift your brain to lower frequencies, it scrambles the phase alignment, so now the phases no longer match up with one another. And if the phases of the electric fields are misaligned, cortex can't communicate with itself. If cortex is in synchrony, all the waves are lined up together, the cortical areas are in excitatory states at the same time. That means they can influence one another. But now, if they're misaligned, if one's in an excitatory state and the other one is not in an excitatory state, now the neurons can no longer talk to one another. So the idea is that this scrambles and cuts cortical communication. And another thing this all works together, is another way of measuring this, is say, now that the system is in this low frequency domain and it's kind of this wobbling with misaligned waves in low frequency domain, you can quantify this by measuring how quickly the cortex can recover from a perturbation like a distraction or a new input. And what Adam Eisen found was that part and parcel with this shift to low frequencies and this scrambling of the phase alignment, the cortex becomes more wobbly and more destabilized, which also tracks loss of consciousness. These are all part of one package where the brain shifts to these lower frequency scrambled domains. Now, I mentioned this not just because this is what anesthesia does in general, but we originally did these studies with a common anesthetic called propofol, which has it acts on GABA receptors, so it has an inhibitory influence. It quiets down the brain. But we've since done these experiments using anesthetic doses of ketamine and dexmedetomidine. And these three anesthetics act on different receptors in the brain, different sets of neurons in the brain. Propofol is inhibitory, and ketamine and dex are excitatory. Yet we saw all three of these effects nearly identical for all three of these different anesthetics. Now, I want to emphasize this point. If you talk to more reductionistic colleagues who don't maybe think this brainwave stuff is epiphenomenal or not important, all what matters are the neurons and the connections. If you talk to people, more reductionistic people, they would have to include these three different anesthetics make you unconscious in three different ways. Instead, we're finding they all do the exact same thing to these low frequency dynamics, exact same thing. If I would show you the data from each of these drugs, you couldn't tell which drug the animal was under. The effects are identical. And what that tells me is that this emergent level of understanding the brain and brainwave dynamics explains something that reductionistic approaches can't. And if you can explain something above and beyond what you can at a more reductionistic level, that means there's an emergent level. To me, it's pretty solid evidence that the emergent level is doing something that's not only functional, but central to cortical function, central to consciousness. Now, importantly, these waves don't just merely stand in place like jump ropes. They don't form standing waves. They form traveling waves that move across the cortex. Now, to show you an example of this, here's a task we just published this year where the animal was fixating a spot of light. Then it saw a scene of 3, 4, or 5 different colored squares. And then after a short memory delay, the scene came back, but one of the squares changed colors. And the animal had to figure out which one it was and look at it. We call that stimulus that changed colors, in this case from yellow to blue, the target. Now, what we found is we measured brainwave dynamics in the frontal cortex, and we found that theta in particular, just below alpha beta, theta, 3 to 6 hertz, was particularly important. And what we found is the animal's ability to detect the target waxed and waned in theta frequencies, 3 to 6 times a second. So here on the left is the animal's reaction time. Up is bad, that's slow. Down is good. And here on the right is the animal's percent correct performance at detecting the target. Up is good, more correct. Down is bad. And what's shown here on the x-axis is the theta phase at the time in which when the array appeared and the animal had to look for the target. So the instantaneous phase of theta when this test array appeared. And what we found is that the animal's reaction time slowed and then sped up, and the animal's ability to detect the target got better or worse, wax and wane in theta, in line with theta waves from the frontal cortex. Now, let me emphasize this. This is a situation where the brain should produce sustained activity on this computer screen so the animal can detect the target as quickly as possible. You think this would be the most steady state thing the brain does, sustained attention. Yet the brain can't help but wax and wane in theta frequencies and drag behavior along with it. Now, interestingly, what we think interestingly, is that the target detection also varied with where the target appeared relative to the theta wave when the theta wave hit. So if the theta wave was peaking, if the target was at the top of the array here in this 1 o'clock and 11 o'clock places here, if the array appeared right when the theta wave was peaking, that meant the animal's performance was high and the reaction time was really fast. The animal was performing well. But as you move down the figure here, down these plots, we see that the best place for the stimulus appearing in the 9 o'clock position or the 3 o'clock position in the middle of the array or the bottom of the array, they do best when the peak of the theta appears a little bit later. So 3 here, 9 o'clock, now when the wave appears a little bit later, the animal's best at detecting the target when it appeared in the middle of the display at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And then if the target was at the very bottom, it was best if the theta wave arrived very late. And what this suggested is that there was like while the animal was in this memory delay, thinking about this array waiting to detect the target, there was a theta wave, like radar, sweeping across the cortex, a traveling wave that swept across the cortex as if this theta wave was scanning the animal's mental image of the scene of squares from top to bottom continually. A theta wave traveling across the cortex like radar, scanning the mental image of this display, and as a result, the animal's performance was better or worse, depending on when the theta wave was and where it was. Now, interestingly, I just talked to you a couple minutes ago about the gamma and alpha beta, how they play a role in top down and bottom up. But what we've been finding, there's mounting evidence that theta kind of acts like a traveling wave that helps coordinate and spread the influences of higher frequency waves. And this was the case here because we found that in the excitatory and inhibitory phases of this low frequency theta wave, the excitatory versus inhibitory phases showed increased gamma power versus increased alpha beta power. So as if the theta wave was dragging these alpha beta gamma dynamics across the cortex to let them do their thing. Okay, so theta may act, so alpha, beta, and gamma may have this push-pull relationship that allows for executive control, but theta may be a more low-frequency carrier wave that helps organize alpha and beta and gamma. Now, I mentioned these traveling waves travel. Well, we think there seems to be a close relationship between neural spiking and neural information processing and traveling waves. So let's leave aside for the moment traveling waves. What I'm showing here on the left here is spiking activity from 200 neurons. 200 neurons. And what it shows is something called subspace coding. So these are, again, activity patterns of 200 neurons. Now, if I have these 200 neurons, I can create a 200-dimensional space to describe what these neurons are doing. Each neuron is on its own vector, and how much it spikes is how much along the vector. So I create this 200-dimensional space. That would be just self-descriptive. But with subspace coding, we ask, how many dimensions does it actually take to describe what these neurons are doing? And it turns out you can describe the spiking activity of 200 neurons or 2,000 neurons using just 3 dimensions. Just 3 dimensions. And what that means is that spiking patterns in cortex are highly coordinated. Spiking in your cortex isn't like insects buzzing chaotically in the night sky. Rather, cortical spiking is more like a murmuration of birds. It's like birds flocking in the sky together. Okay? That's how you can explain 200 neurons with just 3 dimensions. The neurons are all spiking in a highly coordinated fashion. Now, just to go back to subspace coding, what's going on right here is the animal is trained to hold 4 different objects in working memory. And that's the 4 colored lines are. And the fact you're seeing the separation in this subspace this mathematical space describing the neural spiking, the fact that you see the separation between them means that the brain, in this case the prefrontal cortex, is conveying information about the four objects. But now you see these lines are making the circular trajectory. What's going on here is at time 0, we distracted the animal by showing it another object, an irrelevant object, just tried to distract the animal's attention. And what happens is the distraction knocked the neurons out of where they should be in this subspace, and mechanisms of the brain somehow turned around and slowly steered, well, this takes place over about a couple hundred milliseconds. It steered the neurons back to where they were before the distraction. So the circular spiking, the circular travel through subspace are the neurons actually recovering from this distraction. Okay? Now, what does this have to do with brain waves? Well, the question is, how does the brain produce this organization? So you see this circular motion, these neurons are flocking together like birds. How does the brain produce this kind of organization? Well, we found when we record electrical fields from the same neurons where we recorded these, same electrodes where we recorded these spikes, what we found is these rotating traveling waves that exactly corresponded to these rotating movements through subspace. So a direct correspondence between traveling waves rotating across the surface of cortex and neurons traveling in a circular fashion through this mathematical representation called subspace. Now, there's no reason in principle. So what this means is there's this mathematical construction of neural computation in subspace. There's a direct correspondence between a physical thing moving across the surface of cortex, a rotating traveling wave. There's really no reason in principle why this pattern of spiking representing this mathematical representation should correspond directly to the same movement across the surface of cortex, unless these waves have something to do with neural computation. And this suggests a role for the waves in computation, something called analog computation. If a movement of a wave across the surface of cortex corresponds to this movement in subspace, which we all agree is neurons processing information and doing their thing, then that suggests a direct correspondence between waves and neural computation. And here's how analog computation works. You can actually do math with waves. So here's an example of two traveling waves moving in opposite directions. There's a blue traveling wave moving from left to right, and a beige traveling wave moving from right to left. And what the dotted line shows is the summary of those two waves coming together. And what you see is when the waves line up, you get a wave that's twice as big, the dotted line. And when they're 180 opposite from one another, you get a flat line. They sum out to 0. And then you get all the values in between. So essentially by having these two identical sine waves come at one another, you've now done addition and subtraction. And note how this works. The geometry of the waves coming together is modeling the equation addition and subtraction, just by virtue of their geometry. And all the values for the computation you want to do are carried in different parts of the waves. So when the waves come together, all the addition and subtraction happens in parallel. Not sequentially, but it's pure parallel computation. And this is just one dimension and one frequency. Your brain can do this in 3 dimensions and across multiple frequencies simultaneously, anywhere from 1 hertz to 30 hertz or more. And waves are not just useful for addition and subtraction. You can do complex math using analog computation. So here's an example from way back in 1927, MIT's Vannevar Bush built an analog differential analyzer that used wheels and disks, which are the same thing as waves, to solve 18 variable differential equations. That's complex math. He could solve these differential equations, 18 variables, just by setting up how the wheels and disks line up with one another. Then you turn the wheel, you set the wheels up to set the equation. Then when you turn the crank, the wheels turn, and all the variables the equation gets solved simultaneously. And that gives analog computing a huge advantage over digital computing. Digital computing be the kind of the standard model for the way we think about the brain now. No one thinks the brain is completely digital, but we think about it in terms of these synaptic connections and logic gates and these spikes, which are essentially like ones and zeros, unitary events. So analog computation is way more efficient than digital computation. It's information rich. These wave values are waves are continuous signals. The real world is continuous signals. If you want to do digital computation, you got to break the world down into ones and zeros, which already just the information representation is highly inefficient. And also, as I mentioned, you get parallel computation. Digital computation is essentially sequential. You want to solve a differential equation, you solve the first part, second, we got to do it in sequence until you're done. With waves, when waves interact, all the variables interact simultaneously and all the equation gets done simultaneously. It's pure parallel computation. And that is enormously energy efficient. Consider, if you will, the fact that AI consumes enormous amounts of energy. Here's an example from just one state. Currently, the state of Virginia uses 26% of the power it produces to power these AI data centers. And by 2030, that's projected to be as much as half the power that Virginia produces. Microsoft has struck a deal to restart one of the nuclear reactors at 3 Mile Island in order to power an AI data center. So basically, AI, in order to make AI smarter, we're throwing tons of energy at the problem. Okay? Your brain, biology does not work that way. Biology does not solve problems by throwing energy at it. Evolution favors energy efficiency. Biology is always trying to minimize the use of energy. And consider that your far more capable brain, which is way more smarter than any AI out there, that they're powering with nuclear power plants, your brain runs on about 20 watts of power, the power of a dim light bulb. So clearly brains are doing something different. So what I want to suggest here is that ways organize and produce thought. Brains can use AI-like connectionism to store information, but the computation itself is, at least high-level computation in cortex, is done by waves. The waves operate on the right scale. They operate on the mesoscale. They operate on the scale of hundreds of millions of neurons rather than individual neurons, which would be computationally intractable. And they're a mathematically easy way to gain control over a complex system. And they can perform highly efficient analog computation. So the idea here is that synapses represent stored information in the brain. That's all the information baked into your brain about not only about the outside world, but the statistical regularities of the world, and also all the top-down knowledge, all baked into your brain in the connections in cortex. When spiking starts happening, those information patterns get expressed in the spiking, and then they create wave patterns that correspond to that pattern of information as well. Then the waves can come together to create new wave patterns through analog computation. So the idea is that analog computation lets existing wave patterns generate new ones in predictable principled ways. Again, when spiking starts happening, it creates wave patterns that reflect that information, that knowledge stored into the brain, as well as information in the outside world. Then when the waves interact, they can create new wave patterns through the principles of analog computation that then turn around and influence spiking, and then can also, with enough repetition, then bake new information into the synapses and connections in the neurons. Now, every theory of consciousness, every biological theory of consciousness proposes large-scale networks that somehow unify the cortex into a single experience. Here I've illustrated the global workspace theory. The idea is that consciousness necessarily is a unified experience because you need that sort of big picture for it to do its thing. And we know that consciousness is a fusion of all the different things we're experiencing and thinking about at a given moment. So all these theories of consciousness propose this large-scale ensemble that unifies the cortex. Well, I want to suggest that when brainwave patterns produced by analog computations become large and organized enough to organize the cortex and begin to influence the cortex, they bind the cortex into this unified state, and the result is conscious experience. So I thank you for your attention, and I also thank all of my brilliant students who really do all the hard work in creating the science. Thank you very much.